Awesome. Well, hello and welcome to the Eagle and Child podcast. It's so great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us today. I cannot wait to dive into this episode on one of our big players in the Eagle and Child. So the Eagle and Child was named after the Eagle and Child pub where the Inklings would gather together and just discuss their new literary ideas and creations together. And that included C.S. Lewis and Tolkien as the two big people who were there. We've already done an episode on C.S. Lewis, but we haven't yet done an episode on J.R.R. Tolkien. And when I was thinking about who I could invite as a guest to just dive deep into Tolkien, I couldn't think of anyone better than Jasmine Edwards. She is a super fan. She knows Tolkien better than anyone that I could ever think of. And I'm so blessed and excited to have her with us. Jasmine is married to someone that you all would probably know if you're from the Theos U background, Nathan Finocchio. She lives here in Franklin. We're recording this in Franklin, Tennessee, and she is a writer. She's working on a few novels, and she also loves writing about classic movies as well. So just an awesome woman to connect with and get into those sorts of things together. So thank you so much for joining us, Jasmine. It's so great to have you with us.
Thanks, Layla. Thanks for that big wrap. I don't know if I deserve all that, but thank you.
Oh, no.
I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm excited as well. And it's especially exciting when, you know, our guests have such a deep passion for the person that we're looking at. So, thanks so much for guiding us through Tolkien's life and his writings and his impact and everything like that. So could you tell us maybe a little bit, just as we're diving into Tolkien, maybe about like his background, his biography, where did he come from, how was he formed, and who is this guy that we're talking about?
Yeah, for sure. It's funny you should ask that because Tolkien actually disliked the idea of biography in general, but especially as literary criticism. So he's made multiple comments on that, like in his writings and his letters. And his biographer, Humphrey Carpenter, touched on that as he went in to interview Tolkien for his biography. I'll read you one of his quotes because obviously Tolkien says it better than I can. He says,
awesome.
One of my strongest opinions is that investigation of an author's biography is an entirely vain and false approach to his works. So a little bit awkward.
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm so sorry, but we're going to talk about it anyway.
Yeah.
Another thing he said is, I object to the contemporary trend in criticism with its excessive interest in the details of the lives of authors and artists, which only distract attention from an author's works. So, sorry. So I think it's safe to say he was a reasonably private person, and he didn't want his works to be defined or judged on who people perceived him to be.
Very interesting.
Yeah, but he was self-aware enough to make some notes and revise letters from his childhood and his later years. So I think he knew that someone would write about him, at least one person. So yeah.
Yes, many people. Yes. I love the movie. You've seen the Tolkien movie, hey?
Yes, and you know what's so funny? I read a lot, but I find it difficult to, talk. So I get nervous, introvert vibes. So I've got a lot of notes here. But my mum would always make fun of me as a kid because I would pronounce things the way I would read them. And she would always correct my pronunciation. So my whole life I've been saying Tolkien. I didn't even know how to pronounce his name until recently.
Yeah. And I feel like most people are in that boat. Like when the movie came out, I feel like everyone was like, oh, it's Tolkien.
Yeah, right? Yeah. That scene in the movie where he's like, Tolkien, actually it's Tolkien. So I feel kind of weird. I almost feel pretentious being like Tolkien.
Yeah, we know how it's actually pronounced. Yeah.
So actually Tolkien, you probably already know this, has German origins. It's from his dad's side of the family. So Tolkien's parents were Mabel Suffield and Arthur Tolkien. They were both from middle-class families in Birmingham, England. So the Suffields considered themselves a little bit mightier than the Tolkiens because the Tolkiens were originally immigrants, German immigrants. But basically they both had the same kind of background in common, where they had come from a little bit more money and then lost their fortunes by the time Mabel and Arthur were born. So Arthur had to go to South Africa to make money partly in order to be worthy to marry Mabel, who was 13 years younger than him.
Whoa.
So I know. So one of the reasons Mabel, Tolkien's mum, wasn't really allowed to marry Arthur, not just because he didn't have enough money or he was German, but also because she was 13 years younger.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So when she was 21, she was finally allowed by her dad to get on a ship and travel to Bloemfontein, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is South Africa, in 1892 to meet up, and they were married shortly after.
Wow.
Now, Mabel wasn't the biggest fan of South Africa. She missed Birmingham. I don't know why. I've been there. Just kidding. But the climate didn't really agree with her. But Arthur was loving it. He was working at a bank. He was finding success as a manager, and he actually loved the climate. So there was a little bit. I don't know if I would dare to go this far, but some people think that he was a little absent. But she seemed happy enough. She gave birth to John Ronald Reuel Tolkien on the 3rd of January, 1892. Now, the name John came from his grandfather. Reuel was from his dad Arthur's middle name, and Ronald for no apparent reason.
Just because they liked it.
Yeah, they just liked it. And for whatever reason, I think because Mabel, his mum, preferred this name, he was known mostly by his family and friends as Ronald, not as John, throughout his life. But at one point he said that he didn't feel like it was his real name. So it's a bit confusing. Yeah, and some of his friends called him John Ronald or occasionally Tollers as he got older.
Tollers, that's cute. Yeah, that's very Aussie, hey, Tollers.
Well, that's what I thought. It's like I read that it was a nickname typical of the time, and I'm like, I feel like that's like a typical Aussie thing as well.
Yeah,
and 100%. Probably came from England, like a lot of Aussie things.
Yeah.
So he had one younger brother, Hilary, and stop me if you have any questions because I'm rambling. But
nah, this is great.
So when they were quite young, John, or I guess I should call him Ronald. He fell ill a number of times. The climate of South Africa didn't really agree with him, even though his brother was thriving for whatever reason. And his mum, Mabel, thought that he should return to Birmingham for a while just to get back in the English climate. So there was apparently a general idea that the South African climate wasn't suitable for English people or children. I mean, I don't know if it was a romantic idea or if it was true, but I think she missed her family anyway, Mabel.
Yeah, she wants to go back.
Exactly, poor thing. So the three of them hopped on a ship back to Birmingham and spent some time with her family, and his dad was supposed to come visit them, and sadly he died shortly after. And he kept delaying and saying, oh, I'll be there soon, I'll be there soon. So, yeah, I think Tolkien was like, I want to say 4 or less, like, or younger. So his dad, he didn't really have many memories of his dad, and he had barely any memories of his time in South Africa. And he actually felt like, he said when he was older that he felt he related a lot more to his mum's side of the family. Now, I don't know if that was true, although he did physically resemble his mum's side of the family more, or if he just kind of dismissed his dad because he didn't really spend as much time with his dad's family.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. Anyway, this is a lot, so.
No, yeah. So interesting.
Yeah, so you go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I was just going to say, what sort of happened after that? Like, I know he went to like university and stuff, and what was his story from there?
Basically, I'll try to do the shorter version because it's way too long. But not long after, his mum moved the 2 boys to the countryside, and she tutored them. She was pretty educated herself. Yep. So he was reading and writing by age 4. He was very interested in languages, especially Latin. I know, little genius.
4 years old. What the heck?
Yep. He wasn't super interested in the piano, although she did have a go. And they moved to this little village called Stairhole, and there was a corn mill which influenced the Shire in The Lord of the Rings, where the
Oh,
hobbits live.
cool.
Yeah, and that's
That's
kind of
awesome.
yeah, as I mentioned before, he didn't love the idea of admitting that his real life influenced any of his works, but he does admit once, actually in the foreword to the Fellowship of the Ring, to the Lord of the Rings, he does admit that this corn mill influenced the creation of the Shire. And years later, when he saw photos of it kind of changing and becoming, built up, it did upset him. And yeah, so that was an interesting that was one time when he admitted his real life.
Yeah, he sounds extremely private.
I don't know if it's just privacy, but I feel like it's also stubbornness. But I actually relate to it personally, so I don't mind it, because I really this is kind of off the back of what you just said. I personally, one difference between him and C.S. Lewis, which, we, as you mentioned before, that the Eagle and Child pub is where they met. The Inklings was their club later in life. They were kind of frenemies, they've been called. One difference between those two is that C.S. Lewis was maybe like a lot more blatant in his religious themes in, the Narnia Chronicles, whereas Tolkien was very much like, no, I'm not going to preach at people. Obviously, that's not a quote, but that's how I'm summing it up. So I actually kind of personally relate to that, because I prefer to just let my story be my story, whereas some other people that we know very well are more like the opposite. Yeah.
People that you're married to, perhaps.
Yeah. I feel like as I was reading about Tolkien and a lot of the things he was saying, and even listening to some podcasts and hearing quotes that he'd said, I was like, this sounds like me. I'm like, I feel like I am him, he is me. And I feel like Nathan is like the C.S. Lewis to my Tolkien, even though maybe I don't want to take that much credit, because I feel like Tolkien's better, but whatever.
Tolkien is better, yeah. I love Tolkien.
And well, maybe. Anyway, back to his childhood. So basically his mum sadly passed away as well when he was right before that. She converted to Catholicism, which also had a huge influence on his life. He was about 8 years old at the time. That was a really big deal because I think both sides of the family were basically Protestant, and Mabel's dad was not impressed, and there was a lot of friction between her and her family after that. And they made friends with a priest called Father Morgan, who ended up being a kind of, I guess he was their guardian, the two boys' guardian, after their mum died. Yeah, so that had a big influence on him. And they moved in with an aunt who kind of kept them while they went to school, the two boys. And that's pretty much the time that he was at school, he met his future wife, Edith. And she was also an orphan, in Birmingham.
Wow, so they found each other, these two orphans.
It's a lot, but basically they found each other, but then Father Morgan separated them. You'll probably remember from the movie.
Yes.
I don't know. Basically, number one, he said they were too young and he wouldn't let them even correspond via letters, let alone in person, until Tolkien was 21. But I think also the fact she was a Protestant was a little bit of a roadblock. And it was fine because Tolkien had his little group of friends and his first literary club in school, and that helped distract him. But then he and Edith got back together pretty much right after World War I broke out, and they got married, and off he went to the war.
Wow.
So yeah, that was a big deal. And then after that, pretty much was when he started writing more and more. His first published story was it was a poem in 1915. So it was like the year after the war broke out, and he hated it, of course. Later on, he talked about how it was a great disappointment and a terrible, embarrassing poem, like all great writers hate their work.
Hate their own stuff. Yeah.
It was a poem that he wrote for Edith, his wife, because she loved, fairy stories, and it was called Goblin Feet. Oh, wait, no. It was to celebrate her love of springtime. My bad. And
Oh,
he called it
sweet.
the unhappy thing, representing all that I came so soon after to fervently dislike. But it was good
Okay.
practice for his later work because there's over 60
Mm.
poems in Lord of the Rings. So he was a
Wow.
little bit of a poet, yes.
Yes.
So anyway, flash forward, World War One,
Mhm.
horrible time. Most of his friends died. Really
Mm.
sad. And then they had 4 children together, him and Edith, John,
Mm.
Michael, Christopher, Priscilla. So I guess
Mm.
a lot of people would be familiar with the name Christopher Tolkien because he was the
Mhm.
son who has, edited and finished a lot of his father's works. And Tolkien was a very devoted father. He wrote The Hobbit first in 1937. Oh, sorry, it was
Mhm.
published in 1937.
Mhm.
And it was supposed to be a children's story. And it is, I guess. It's one of my favorite books, if not my favorite book. And then The
Wow.
Lord of the Rings was supposed to be a sequel to that, but it became so much bigger. And I guess it's
Mm.
part of his, like, he talks in an essay on fairy tales a lot about, like, what fairy tales
Mm.
are, what they aren't, how, basically we should basically give more credit to children, with the scarier
Mm.
themes and things like that.
Wow.
So Lord of the Rings blew up. It became way bigger than just a sequel to The Hobbit. He wrote that over a number of years. In the middle of that almost was World War II, which again, he
Mm.
claims multiple times that he wasn't influenced by in the
Mhm.
writing of, especially like The Return of the King. And I mean, who's to say, right?
Yeah.
We can take him at his word. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah.
What do you love about The Hobbit? Were you saying that's your
Oh,
favorite
that's a
book?
good question.
Yeah.
I think I haven't read it in a while, so I need to reread it and decide if it's
Mm.
still my favorite. But I think it's mostly nostalgic. When I read it, I think I came to Tolkien's work. For me, it was a little later. I mean, I was 12 or 13. I think I was 13 when I read the Lord of the Rings. I might have been just a little younger with The Hobbit. But for me, that was like I'd already read Harry Potter, or at least all the ones that were out. I'd read like tons of English books and novels and fairy stories and all the classic fairy stories. So I actually read The Lord of the Rings between the Fellowship of the Ring movie and the Two Towers movie, I think. Or maybe it was even between the Two Towers and the Return of the King. So I felt kind of late to the game, being like 13. I'm
13,
finally
yeah.
reading it like I'm an idiot. I
Later
don't
in
know
life.
anything. I'm reading it after the movie. That's not cool. But I remember reading it. I had the whole book in like one giant thing, and I'm like, it was so heavy. And I'm like, I went to work with my dad one day, and I'm like reading bits and telling him the difference between the movie and the book. But The Hobbit, I liked the simplicity of it. I loved it was just a great adventure story, and I loved adventure stories, like both in movie and book format growing up. So yeah, it's a really good
beautiful.
book. Yeah, I think they kind of when they made, Peter Jackson made the Hobbit movies, he made it a little more overblown, for various reasons than it should have been. But I think it's like the simplicity of the book that is its beauty. Yeah, because The Lord of the Rings is very long, and that's its own thing. But yeah, they're both good.
Yeah. I love the fact that it can speak to all ages as well. Like you were saying, you were about like 12 or 13 when you read it.
Yeah.
And like kids can read it, but then also adults can read it and just take it deeper in its themes and how it can have an effect on you personally.
Yes,
in your own sort of journey and adventure in life. So maybe can you dive like maybe into some of those different works that Tolkien is known for? What should we be reading if we want to get into Tolkien? Like what are some of the big works that we should dive into?
I mean, most people already know, or should already know, his bigger works. So probably The Hobbit is a great one to start with for obvious reasons. And then The Lord of the Rings, those are probably the two best ones. And then we've got all the unfinished tales and the appendices and all kinds of other beautiful stories, including stories. So he did a lot of editing and translating of,
Wow.
Old English and all kinds of different languages. So he did like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, I believe. He's got a translation of that. So of other stories that that he was really passionate about. So those are fun to read as well. The Silmarillion is a big one. That's the big kind of like boring to some people, with all the myths and the myths of Middle Earth, which is cool. So obviously those would be the things he's the most well known for, but he was also respected as, a linguist, and he loved to learn and create his own languages, and he was a professor as well. So yeah, he had a lot going for him.
Just the idea of someone creating their own language, like you have to be a bit of a genius to do that.
Genius, I know.
It's insane.
In my mind, so I thought it was interesting that he kind of wished that England had more of a mythology, and he was disappointed that they didn't have like more ancient, like their own kind of ancient mythology. I guess the closest would be something like, King Arthur and the Round Table, but even that's more of a French thing. So he loved those stories. So I think he's obviously almost written his own mythology with Middle Earth. And I think partly that's what he set out to do in creating that world and all the beautiful languages. And it is obviously like very much influenced by England and, the landscape and the history, and which is really cool. So in some ways he created his own, which is nice.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Awesome. So, Jasmine, can you tell us maybe like the impact that Tolkien has had and his work has had on us today and on, Christians and the world, and what sort of influence has he been able to have with his writing and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can mostly just speak for myself. But I think in general, obviously, one of the best-selling stories of all time in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, one of the most influential stories of all time. I think he also added a lot of gravitas to just the genre of fantasy in general, which was not really a respected genre. It's still not respected at times, but, he gave high fantasy more of a respectable name. I think to this day you'd be hard pressed to not find a fantasy writer who is influenced by Tolkien.
Wow.
And yeah, I'd say he's definitely the most influential in that genre. And yeah, it's still going strong. I mean, now we've got all they just keep coming, the new TV shows and Game of Thrones, and it just keeps going. So, and then for Christians, I guess for me, I think I love the way he balances fantasy and fiction and fairy tale with his religious beliefs. So he doesn't feel like, and for me, that was really helpful because I grew up reading a lot of like fiction and fairy tales, and I was very into all of that stuff. And I love that you can look at that through a Christian lens, especially with his work and I guess many similar works like C.S. Lewis's stories, and then other stories that are influenced by Tolkien. So I think it's nice that you don't have to choose. You don't have to say, ooh, because that's got some kind of, fairy tale element to it, it's bad or demonic or whatever else.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that was really cool for me. And I think someone, like a lot of people, especially someone with my kind of personality type, we're actually better at understanding deep themes through storytelling. So I think that, that's been really important for me in the way that I see the world and understand things. It's been like a very beautiful and important way, especially in regards to my faith. So I think his influence goes on and on.
Yeah. I didn't know like he had influenced like all of these fantasy writers and everything as well. I didn't realize how prolific his impact was. Incredible.
George Martin, who wrote Game of Thrones, I think he's called himself George R.R. Martin, I believe. And I'm pretty sure he added the
renamed
R's.
himself after
Yeah,
Tolkien.
because he's such a... Correct me if I'm wrong, anyone, but it's either George R. Martin or George R.R. Martin. I can't remember which one he did, but I know that he's a huge Tolkien fan. So, yeah, it's pretty funny.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, so maybe like, because we usually talk about some like funny stories about people, but we've both also been to Hobbiton in New Zealand.
Yes.
You've been there, right? Yeah, like tell us a little bit about that, because like I think any like huge fan of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit and stuff should definitely visit there at some point. So beautiful. Tell us about your experience.
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to go there in 2020, actually, right before COVID hit, like the month before.
Wow.
Yeah.
Crazy.
So I went with a couple of friends and Nate, and it was a rainy day, but one of those days where the sun is out and it's raining. So we got the full experience. And yeah, I mean, you've been there. It's beautiful going around to all the different hobbit holes, hearing about how I believe they got rid of the set after the Lord of the Rings, but then they rebuilt it for the Hobbit movies, and then they kept it ever since. And now they have local people who I believe own the land and help caretake, which is really nice. Wow. And, you know, had a little drink at the pub, the Green Dragon.
Very cool.
It's fun. Yeah, it was really nice. Took some photos. New Zealand's beautiful, so they couldn't, I mean, you'd think England, but they couldn't have been a more beautiful place to film those movies, honestly. Yeah.
Absolutely.
What about you? Did you have a good time?
Oh, I loved it. And I got a whole bunch of photos and stuff as well. The one thing that struck me was just the attention to detail, like that they put into. They were telling us a story about that tree. Did you hear that story about the tree? And
it
had
party
like,
tree?
Yeah, something like that. And it had like maybe 300,000 leaves that they had created for it or something. Am I right?
Oh my gosh, the people who worked on those movies. When I was a young, I guess a teenager, and all the DVDs came out with the extended editions, and they had the behind the scenes, like hours and hours and hours. It was my dream to be on that movie set. Like Weta Workshop so cool. And all the work they put in painstakingly to every detail, like the miniatures to the costumes to the weapons to the stunt doubles. Like they did such a beautiful job.
Absolutely.
It's so cool to see. Yeah.
And it's so inspiring, like for us as I think like creatives, artists, writers, to really put your all into the work and really like, you know, value every part of it, not just sort of like, you know, think that it's not important, the art's not important, the story's not important, because I loved how you mentioned before that like this actually helped build your faith, like your understanding and your concepts of faith and stuff. So it's a really powerful tool that can be used, you know, to influence people for the gospel and for God, and it can just have a really profound and deep impact on people, just deeper than just like a surface level of entertainment. It's actually something that goes into like a person's spiritual formation and their identity formation and different things like that as well.
Definitely. And I think you know, Tolkien was aware of that as much as he probably didn't want to be, because even though he said he didn't like allegory, so he didn't like being told what he set out to mean, but he was okay or he understood application, which is people can't help but, you know, make applications, and it's the freedom of the reader to, you know, apply meaning to what we read. So definitely, like in terms of our religious beliefs, we have applied meaning, and I think that's cool. And I don't think he'd mind that.
Absolutely. No, I loved Hobbiton. It was so cool. And growing up, so I grew up in New Zealand.
I forgot about that.
And so one of our friends actually from Wellington, she had a horse, and so she was one of the extras. It was a lady, like one of my parents' friends. But she was like in one of the Lord of the Rings movie, like galloping on the horse and stuff like that. So pretty crazy.
Oh my gosh, I'm so jealous. That would have been my dream. She's probably like one of the writers of Rohan.
Totally. So I can see you doing that. I can absolutely see you doing that.
If I could ride a horse confidently, I would have loved to have been an elf. Do you think you would be an elf, a man, a dwarf, a hobbit, or a wizard?
Oh, good
Or what would your
question.
friends or family say you would be?
I would love to be an elf. I feel like people would say that I'd be a hobbit though.
Oh, that's so funny because
Yeah.
my sister was watching the movies recently, I think, and she
Yeah.
said she was, or maybe she was watching the new Amazon Prime show, and she
Yeah.
said that she was talking with her husband about how she thinks our whole family are hobbits. She's like, we're all
That's
hobbits,
awesome.
and I'm in the group chat, and I'm like, no, I'm an
Oh,
elf. She's like,
yeah,
no, you're a
I
hobbit
see
too.
you
I'm
as
like,
an elf.
no, I'm an elf. I'm like, speak for
Totally.
yourself,
Totally.
commoner.
Speaking for yourself. Yeah.
And then I feel like Nate would fancy himself a wizard. I'm like, maybe
Yes.
you're maybe Radagast the Brown, the
Yes.
eccentric guy that like goes around on a sled.
Yeah, that sounds like Nathan. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, maybe Jasmine, I know you've got a few books with you. Can you maybe tell us like some of the quotes that have impacted you, or some of the big quotes from Tolkien's work that
Yeah,
you
I mean,
love?
there's just so many. I feel like Gandalf has all the best quotes.
Oh,
You know
absolutely.
what I mean? So maybe I'll just read like a couple of his, but I got one. It's just nice to read it from the book.
Yeah.
So. I mean,
Story time with
people
Jasmine.
who have story time. We should do this for the whole hour.
Yeah.
I feel like most of the people already know this quote. It's one of the most famous ones, but for good reason. It's so good. It's in the movie as well, more or less. Changed a little bit. So anyway, I wish it need not have happened in my time, said Frodo. So do I, said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. It's just short and sweet, but every time I think of that quote or say it out loud or whatever, I get really emotional. I'm like, because I'm such a baby, like I'm so sensitive and things in the world really bother me. And that's like, that quote has really helped me, like, learn how to cope and make sense of it, which is nice. And another one that Gandalf said, which I love, which again, people will be very familiar with, when him and Frodo are talking about Gollum and whether or not Bilbo should have killed Gollum when he had the chance. I feel like this quote is really cool because it deals with judgment and who is fit to judge.
Wow.
So Gandalf says, many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death in judgment, for even the very wise cannot see all ends. And anyway, there's more to it, but I just think that's really cool. It's like, who are you to know if that person deserves death, And another one that he says about the third age of Middle Earth ending and a new age beginning, I find really interesting because I know Tolkien, like myself, disliked a lot of modernity and he loved old things. And so I think it's kind of cool that Gandalf is helping come to terms with a new age beginning. So he says, because I know that maybe Tolkien wouldn't like that, a new age beginning, and I also don't like that. Anyway, he says, the third age of the world is ended and the new age is begun, and it is your task to order its beginning and to preserve what must be preserved. For though much has been saved, much must now pass away. So I think that's cool. I just like the balanced perspective. Another one he says, which is short and sweet, I will not say do not weep, for not all tears are an evil. I feel like that's cool.
Yeah,
And
that's beautiful.
It's nice because I cry a lot, so obviously I relate to that. But
You're like, there's a reason.
I mean, I do like, there's a lot of talk, a lot of like fan videos on TikTok. I'm on TikTok a lot, which I shouldn't be, but of especially the movies, but talk like some fan edits of the male characters and how the male characters are like such great examples of masculinity, because a lot of them are like, obviously they're brave, but they're also quite like gentle and loving to one another. And I think that a lot of that probably came from, Tolkien's close friendships that he had, especially in high school and college.
Beautiful.
And I think that's a really nice thing, like the fellowship you know, is really cool between the men, because obviously it's a lot of male characters, which is fine.
Yeah. Yeah. We don't mind.
Even on International Women's Day, which is today. Thanks a lot, Tolkien. No, actually, he wrote beautiful female characters too. He loved his mum. His mum educated him, and he loved and respected his wife. But you know, he was a man.
Yeah, exactly. That's it, who his best friends are going to be.
Yeah, exactly.
They're awesome.
And they're beautiful characters. Quote. Like, they're relatable to anyone, I think, you know, like I guess maybe you would call it a universal character. It's universally relatable because it's well written. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can definitely see yourself in the characters for sure.
Yeah.
So we usually like to sort of finish up by looking at like maybe some interesting facts or a fun story or something like quirky that we didn't know about the person. Do you know anything about Tolkien sort of in that vein?
Yeah, well, I could tell you a couple of funny, just like 2 facts about Lord of the Rings that changed as he wrote it. So one is that he was considering a romance between Aragorn and Eowyn, which is kind of like, the love triangle. So I thought that was interesting. And then another one, which is kind of funny, is, you know, they introduce Aragorn as Strider when you first meet him. And he was originally called Trotter, which I think is a dumb name, but I'm like, that's a good change. But it's because he was a hobbit with wooden shoes, so not very sexy. Aragorn's like sexy as a man / descended from, you know, ancient part elf. But a fun fact about, I guess, one thing that I thought was kind of funny that I learned recently is that Tolkien and I believe C.S. Lewis hated Disney and Walt Disney.
Ooh.
And they talked a lot of crap about him. And I thought it was funny, especially like Disney's still so big these days, like that, you know, they own everything now. And Tolkien was very adamant that they would never adapt his work. And I think at one point his publisher maybe like went behind his back to try to like make a deal, and Disney was like, no, it's too expensive, like we won't do that. So I don't think he would have been very happy with that. But he did describe I think it might have even been while he was still alive, which is kind of like he described Disney's work as vulgar and Walt Disney as simply a cheat who is hopelessly corrupted by profit seeking.
Whoa.
I know, rough. I recognize his talent.
Tell us what you really think, Tolkien.
Honestly,
tell us how you really feel.
Harsh. I recognize his talent. Nice. But it has always been to me hopelessly corrupted. In most of his pictures, there are admirable or charming passages, but the effect of all of them is to me disgusting. Some have given me nausea. He's a little harsh, but I know that he and C.S. Lewis went to see Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and it came out, I believe, the same year that The Hobbit was released, at the end of the year. And he was offended by the dwarves because he had very strong ideas about how dwarves should be, and he didn't like things to be kind of twee and like childish. You know, he wanted them to be a lot more respectable, and, you know, obviously his dwarves were warlords.
Wow. So was he some sort of purist or something? I don't understand with the writing terms, but like purist in fantasy or mythology or something like that he didn't like anyone using it in other ways.
I think in a lot of ways he was a purist, I mean, probably, but I think, you know, he had these very strong ideas about fairy tales and fairy tale characters, and he didn't like it to be childish. And he developed those ideas as he got older. But even as a kid, he wasn't really keen on certain fairy tales. Like, I don't think he loved like the Grimm's fairy tales, but he liked more like the knights and the dragons. He was a lot more interested in men in fairy tales, like the adventure of men and what they learn. And obviously he has all the creatures as well, but they're mostly
so interesting.
Wow, pretty cool.
And I wonder if he was looking, because obviously he said his father died when he was 4 years old. I wonder if he was looking to them in some way to sort of like influence him and model to him, what a man is supposed to be, or I don't know,
Yeah.
as a young kid or something.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, obviously, he had the priest, which was his kind of guardian and like male figure in his life, and then he had like close male friendships his whole life, which was really cool, and peers. But yeah, it's interesting. You can definitely read into all of that if you want. But I don't know if he had daddy issues. I mean, maybe. I'm sure maybe he did, but he seemed to kind of just almost, that I don't even remember my dad, you know what I mean? So yeah, it's interesting. Maybe.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jasmine. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about Tolkien? Anything that you want to leave us with if our listeners, our watchers want to dive into Tolkien? Is there anything that they should know before we head off?
I would definitely recommend. Can you hear me? Sorry, my AirPods are mucking up. I would definitely recommend reading his essay on fairy tales. I think that's a really good one, and I could read a quote from that because I think it's really cool. If you don't mind, another quote.
Of course, please.
Yeah. So he says, "For it is man who is, in contrast to fairies, supernatural." Which I think is really interesting. So he's basically saying men are more supernatural than the idea of fairies. Whereas they are natural, far more natural than he. Such is their doom. The road to fairyland is not the road to heaven, nor even to hell, though some have held that it may lead thither indirectly by the devil's tithe. Anyway, there's so many good, like, there's one more that I love. I read this one.
Yeah.
But I love that he's saying that. He's like, it's not this way, it's not that way, it's not so deep, it's not evil, but it's, fairy contains many things beside elves and fays, and besides dwarves, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all the things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. That's one of my favorite Tolkien quotes, actually. That's a really good one. Yeah, it's so cool. So I definitely recommend. It's a very, very long essay, but there's so much good stuff in it, and you can just Google it. It's available online. Yeah. And one last thing. Have you been to the Eagle and Child pub?
No, I need to go. I'm going to England in October. Oh, tell us about it.
You have to go. It's so cute. I went and sat at the little table where they where C.S. Lewis and, Tolkien and their friends allegedly sat, and I had a pint, and I looked out and felt like a nerd. You'll love it. It's beautiful.
I'm so excited. Yeah. Can't wait. And I've never been to like Oxford or anything either. Like very excited to sort of immerse myself in their world,
100%. You'll love it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jasmine. Thanks for joining us. If people want to check out your stuff online, like where could they find you? Where could they connect with you?
Yeah. So there's not me and my private world. There's not a whole lot going on. I do have an Instagram called @LoneWolvesClub where I review classic movies. So that's like a fun little project that I do with a friend that we're expanding on soon. Hopefully we'll have a website up with all the reviews and some drink pairings to go with them. And I'm working on my own fantasy novels. So just remember my name, I guess, in the next decade, because it's probably going to take me at least that long to finish it. But
so cool. Can you give us maybe like a like peep into like what you're writing about, or is it total secret, top secret?
Well, it might change a lot. That's another thing. I could just go on forever, but that's another thing that I like about what Tolkien said. Like, he does talk about how, which I agree with, you kind of discover the story as it goes. Like, the story's in you and you're discovering it. And, we're not the primary creator, like God is the primary creator, but we're recreating creation. And I feel like that about stories. It comes to you as you write it, but it's definitely a fantasy series in an immersive fantasy world. And my continent or my country, I guess, is more kind of based on Italy, because I love Italy rather than
beautiful.
Yeah, that's all I'll tell you.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure we're all excited to read it. Thank you so much for joining us, Jasmine. And thank you to everyone who's watching or listening to us today. We will catch you next time on the Eagle and Child podcast. See you then. Thanks so much for tuning into the Eagle and Child podcast. That's all from us for today. If you want to support us, you can like, subscribe, or drop us a review. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram @Eagle and Child podcast. We'll catch you next time. Much love.